Also, before we get into it, the author based the opening scene on this piece of art. Audio listeners love you to death. I also have the Twitter post linked in the description of the podcast. Chapter 2. Phil trudges through the water carefully, legs moving slowly but surely as he hikes the thighs under his arms up just a tad bit higher. Behind him, he can hear the soft sounds of sleep coming from the tiny boat they'd thrown together out of plywood and duct tape. Tommy's still asleep, having dozed off an hour or so earlier after Tubbo had started answering questions in that sleepy kind of quiet way. How the younger kid is sleeping in this situation is beyond Phil, but he at least takes care not to let the water touch his feet too often. It's up to Phil's hips, cold and dark and sludgy, and occasionally he hits his foot on something hard and stiff, and he always tenses up, ready to throw Tubbo off and pull out his shotgun. But each time he freezes and waits for the sound of gurgling dead to push themselves out of the water, it never comes. It's always a stick, or a mailbox, or the remnants of some shapeless human-made mass. The water never gets any deeper, and Phil's grateful, but he's ready to be out of it. Floods weren't unexpected. Sewer systems had backed up with leaves and debris after their workers had abandoned them or died, and after a heavy rainstorm had gone on for 3 days straight, their route out of the safe house had been blocked. Phil had waited as long as they could, but before long they'd gotten to the bottom of their supplies, so they made the trek out into the floodwaters, hoping that they would only last a street or two before thinning out, and only being a nuisance at most. But no. It's been nearly 5 hours, and Phil's seen no end to the dull water. They'd woken up earlier than the boys had gotten up for quite a while, so it's really not a surprise their chatter had faded off into sleepy silence after a bit. Speaking of them, one of them speaks up. Tubbo, who's been riding on his back, shifts, then speaks. "Phil," he says, voice quiet and thick with sleep. "Look, you're 8 o'clock. He looks. There are a couple of dilapidated houses rising above the water, and a few cars sitting in the street, gutted and rusted metal all that's left. And in those cars, pressed against the remaining glass, are dead walkers. Rotted faces stare blindly out toward them, fingers shifting against the car frame and heads tipping as the ripples from Phil's movements hit them. He slows, then stops, the small boat containing Tommy resting against his hips and back. The ripples stop, and the dead walkers seem to rest after a moment. From behind him, he can hear Tubbo's shaky breath again. "Do you think they know we're here?" he asks. Phil tips his head back to try and get a look at his face. "Shh," he says, and hopes it's reassuring enough. Holding tight to Tubbo's legs, he begins to shift forward again. He drags his feet along the pavement, doing his best not to let the water move too much around them. Tubbo stays quiet, and Phil knows his eyes are on the dead, and takes that as enough warning to be able to look ahead and work out their escape route. The water doesn't seem to get any lower at any point, but there are a few houses coming up on the right that they could potentially get behind or in. It could serve as a way to cut their movements off from those dead walkers. He thought he saw about 4 or 5, and while he trusts Tommy and Tubbo to fight their way out, there's other dangers lying below the waters, and other dead that he's sure will expose themselves with the ruckus they'd make. He takes Tubbo's silence as reassurance that his movements aren't alerting them, and changes their course slightly to head towards one of the houses. They go slowly, Phil taking one careful step after another, making sure that Tommy in his boat is floating softly behind them, not hitting anything. The rope connecting them is short and thick, wrapped a few times around Phil's waist and securely knotted around one of the small support pieces on the boat. "Door on the right," Tubbo says quietly once they're close to the house, and Phil takes his guidance without question. Towards the right they go, keeping his eyes on the water and avoiding what looks like a piece of aluminum roof. Finally, after far too long of holding his breath, Phil pushes open the back door to the flooded house. It's half open, leading into the kitchen, and he slowly makes his way inside. Tubbo relaxes as they get out of the sight of the visible dead walkers, and Phil finds the stairs in a few moments. "Stay here," he tells them, letting Tubbo off onto relatively dry space, and untying Tommy's boat from around his waist. He hands the rope to Tubbo, whose face is pale and one cheek still bruised from a tussle last week. "I'm going to clear down here, then we can head upstairs and rest. Don't wake him up just yet," he says, nodding towards Tommy, then shifts to make a loop of the downstairs. Inside, the water is lower than outside on the street, but it's darker and dingier. He keeps a firm hand on his axe as he sweeps his feet around, pulling up any object he comes across. None of them are dead walkers. Coming back to the stairs, he finds Tubbo and Tommy where he left them, although Tommy's sat up and awake now. He glares at Phil as he comes around the corner, but Phil just holds a finger up to his mouth and gives him a look. Whatever words Tommy has for him can wait until Phil's swept upstairs. He heaves himself out of the water, brushing past Tubbo and taking a moment to slip off his boots and socks, grinning as he squeezes them out and both boys grimace. His feet are pale and damp, so he leaves his shoes off as he makes his way upstairs. Everything's a bit damp in the hallway, probably thanks to an open window at the end of the long space. He takes a minute to shut it, peering out of the glass and making sure nothing was headed their way from this direction. Each of the bedrooms comes out empty, and the bathroom as well. He determines which one's the driest, and heads back to the stairs. Tubbo's already waiting at the top, peering around the wall, and his face lights up when he sees Phil sheathing the axe. "It's empty," he promises. "Second door on the left is the biggest. Get in there and dry off." "Thank God," Tommy says, pushing past Tubbo with a huff. He's got their backpack on his back and nudges past Phil, headed toward the room. Tubbo follows, and Phil leans back to call out again. "Raid the closets for blankets and dry clothes. I'm going to check out the kitchen. Don't get too loud, there are still things outside that I don't want to deal with right now." A chorus of "okays" reaches his ears and he smiles, heading back into the water. One of them, probably Tubbo, has tied their boat to the railing of the stairs, floating absently with only the damp blanket from the last house they'd been at. Phil tosses it into the wreck that's in the living room, heading to the kitchen. The pantry's empty for the most part, a bag of crisps up on the very top that he manages to snag. The fridge is no better, which is expected, and he hardly tries the cabinets, although there are a few tins of green beans. Better than nothing, so he tucks them into the crook of his elbow and heads back up to the dry space. When he enters the master bedroom, Tommy's tucked up on the bed while Tubbo's at the window, peeking out into the street. "It's raining again," he informs Phil, and Tommy groans, shoving his face deeper into the pillow he'd been laying on. "Good thing we got in here when we did then," Phil comments, dumping the cans onto the foot of the bed and watching them race to inspect what he'd found. Tommy turns one of them over in his hands and scoffs, but doesn't say anything directly negative. Tubbo grins. "Green beans!" he exclaims, tossing the can he'd grabbed back into the pile of 4. "Yum. I bet they're old as fuck," Tommy points out, but Tubbo just shrugs and shoves him over so he can clamber onto the bed. Phil sets about drying himself off, snagging a towel from where one of the two had discarded it, and changing out his pants for the set he kept in his backpack. Hours in the water leaves him feeling damp and muggy, no matter how much he rubs with the towel, and the humidity in the air certainly isn't helping. "And you were hogging the boat," Tubbo's saying when Phil tunes back in, and he gives them both a look at the argumentative tone. He knows traveling like this is hard. Hell, they're all tired, but he doesn't want to deal with any fights right now. "If you had been in the boat, I think we'd be in more trouble than we are now," Phil says to try and placate Tubbo. "Tommy would have shouted when he saw them out there, instead of telling me quietly." "Fuck you!" Tommy bounces up onto his knees at the end of the bed, glaring at Phil. "There were zombies out there? And neither of you bothered to wake me up?" "Like I said," Phil continues, "quietly. I don't want to have to deal with 5 of them in hip-deep water that I can't see into." Pointedly, he gives Tommy a look, who shrinks back and shrugs after a moment, like the facts are maybe permissible excuses for not letting him fight. "Fair enough," he says, and Tubbo cackles behind him against the headboard. "I'm so better at being stealthy," he says, kicking his foot out and catching Tommy right on the back of his leg with it. Phil just watches as Tommy turns, tackling Tubbo right in return. He rolls his eyes as they start to fight, letting them get the energy out. It's needed, and if he doesn't, then tomorrow will be worse when they start back into the water. They play for a bit, until Tubbo's got Tommy's head pressed down into the sheets and a knee on his back, with a triumphant, but quiet, cry. They start for round 2, and Phil gets up from where he's been setting up a blanket pad and pillows on the floor for himself, grabbing the cans to crack them open. "Come get something to eat," he says, snagging the pack from where Tommy had dropped it. Some dried rabbit comes out, and the can opener. Dinner is quiet, and so is the night. Despite having slept and dozed most of the day, Tommy and Tubbo quiet themselves as it gets dark, and the soft patter of rain apparently lulls them to sleep quicker than any lullaby of zombie noises ever had. Phil lies awake for a while, staring out the window and trying his best not to think. Morning comes, and Phil is hot, warm, physically sweating under the blankets he'd piled on last night, while listening to the rain and sounds of sleep from the bed above him. He groans a bit, ignoring the hands shaking him awake in favor of trying to shove off the blanket. Phil! Tubbo doesn't sound too alarmed, so he doesn't immediately reach for the gun. Phil, get up! I told you to let him sleep for a little longer, Tommy says from somewhere across the room, and he can hear fumbling around as something clunks to the carpeted floor. Phil decides to keep his eyes stubbornly shut. But it stopped raining! It's sunny even! That explains why he's hot then, and why the room seems brighter when he finally decides to open his eyes. Phil blinks the sticky sleep from them, lifting his hands as he sits up to get the gunk out of the corners. Tubbo's sitting next to him and turned away, facing to where Tommy's shoving the cans of green beans into the backpack. The rest of the room is fairly clean, the bed not even messy from where they'd slept in it last night. Probably Tubbo's doing, but Phil wasn't awake to confirm it. Did you go downstairs? He asks, moving to tug his shoes and socks on from where they'd sat beside his makeshift bed. Tubbo shakes his head, but Tommy nods. Just a look. And Phil rolls his eyes as he tightens the laces. Tommy can hold his own, sure, and nothing went wrong, but still, it was risky, and Phil knows that Tommy knows based on how he won't look his way. Despite his displeasure, he doesn't say anything, and instead starts to help clean up what they brought in and raid the rest of the place. He sends Tubbo to check the bathrooms for anything useful, and Tommy stays with him as they check each of the bedrooms over again for anything helpful. There's some teenage boy clothes in one of the closets, covered in a layer of dust, but good looking enough when Phil swats a hand around to dislodge it. He lets Tommy dig through it for some new shirts, and limits them both to 2. Clothing isn't really in short supply like food is, but it's nice to see their faces light up at some stupid shirt logo they hadn't seen in ages. Eventually, it's back into the floodwaters. This time, Tommy's insistent on walking alongside Phil, and Tubbo takes the boat. Ropes catch around their waists, and as Phil ties Tommy to himself, he gets a hand on his shoulder, catching his eyes. Stay behind me the whole time, he instructs him. Don't stray, don't make sudden movements, and if you feel or see anything, tell me. Tommy's mouth is a firm line, and he nods. Alright mates, Phil says once he's sure Tommy has got those instructions in his head. Tubbo slips into the boat, wincing at how it rocks and nearly tips. They're not the best builders, but it's still afloat, so Phil supposes it's better than nothing. Off we go. And off they go, into the water. It's no higher than it was yesterday, but there's a slight current under the still surface, especially in the roads. Phil keeps to where he thinks the sidewalks would be, sloshing their way through mud and grime, and occasionally shifting whenever he comes across something large and immovable under the water. It's up to his hips and Tommy's waist, the kid grimacing every time Phil gets a peek back at him. But he follows the instructions from before they left, keeping behind Phil and a hand on the boat Tubbo's floating in. Tubbo serves as their eyes, not worrying about what's in the water and instead watching ahead of them trying to figure out which way to go. It looks shallower up ahead, he says after an hour or so of silence, other than the occasional call out for directions or warning. No dead walkers in sight this morning, but Phil's cautious anyways. There's a soft ripple as Tubbo shifts to peek up higher from the boat. And I see more buildings. Probably the center of town, Tommy says, and Phil agrees. Should we avoid it? Tubbo asks, the water rippling again. It definitely gets shallower up there though, maybe knees at most. We can probably head that way, Phil says, having stopped for the moment. He turns, watching the two behind him, and then peering beyond. I haven't seen any of them around, so I feel like anywhere we go at this point is going to be risky. He doesn't miss how they look at each other, a little worried, but determined at the same time. Tubbo gnaws on his lip, then shrugs. Phil takes it as an okay, and turns back around to keep dredging on. Tubbo was right. After another block or so of flooded houses and a lopsided tree, the water shallows a bit, then more, and more, until all that's left is up to mid-calf. It goes on like that for a bit, but Phil can see dry land ahead. It's relieving. He slows to a stop and turns a little bit, facing the two behind him and starting to untie the ropes around their waists. Tubbo, hop out, he says, waiting for him to do so before taking the rest of their stuff out of the little raft. He gives it a shove back into deeper water. Say goodbye to the boat. We're 16, not 3, Tommy grumbles, but Tubbo lifts his hand to wave anyway. Bye, boat, he says. You were kinda shit, but thanks for keeping us mostly dry and safe. Phil finds himself laughing a little, bringing a hand up to stifle his amused snorts and not get too loud. Come on, he says after a minute, turning to slosh away towards dry land. We're not far now. Towns are dangerous. They're not deadly for the most part, but avoiding them is what Phil prefers. He's seen what towns could be like, especially if they had a larger population before the infection spread. Huge masses of dead walkers, ones that could run quick and spit at you before you even had a chance to pull your mask on. They all do so preemptively now, the water gone from their feet as they head onto the dry concrete and asphalt of the road. Phil's glad to be out of the water, the constant pit of fear in his stomach settling a little as it deals with something. This kind of danger is familiar, the constant checking around corners and holding Tommy back before he can forge onwards without looking. For a kid who's grown up in the apocalypse, Phil would think he'd be a bit more cautious, but it turns out to mostly be moot, since as they walk, Phil hears and sees nothing. No clicking, no shuffling, no groaning wheezes. No monsters. The town is silent and empty. Even the stores that he passes, with their open doors and empty shelves, are quiet. Usually there would be at least a few dead walkers in there, shuffling in the aisles and mindlessly scraping across the tile as they hid from the midday sun. But nothing's there. They're all empty. Empty enough that Phil lets Tommy and Tubbo out of his sight for a few minutes so he can raid a pharmacy, and they can check out one of the dilapidated comic stores. He comes back with a bottle of aspirin, a rare find, and they come back each with one comic book to their name. Phil admires their restraint. They still see no monsters. Do you think someone's come through and just cleared this place out? Tommy asks, and Phil doesn't bother to tell him to keep his voice down. They're in the back of what was once a grocery store, sat on the corner of 2 streets with a good long view down either way. They'd been able to see anything coming for a block or two. If they did, then where are the bodies? Tubbo points out. Or the blood? Maybe they cleaned up. Took them somewhere, Tommy says, hopping up to sit on the edge of the counter of one of the registers. He leans back, running a finger over the edge of a faded magazine. Phil leans against the counter across from him, Tubbo peering under the counters a few feet away in search of candy. Phil doesn't think there's any left, but he won't stop him from looking. Seems rather organized, he points out. Killing all those dead walkers, then dragging their bodies somewhere to be disposed of would be a huge effort, especially in a town this size. It would require more than one person for sure. You think there's a compound? Tubbo seems to have the same idea, and pops up from where he's been crouched down, eyes shining. Maybe there are people here, somewhere. Real people, alive. We could find them and say hello. Based on the grimace Tommy puts on, Phil doesn't think that's exactly his ideal plan of action. I don't know, Phil says, running a hand through his hair and watching Tubbo disappear behind the counters again. Compounds don't usually take more than one person at a time, rations and all that, and we don't have any marketable skills either. We fight good, Tubbo says, voice slightly muffled. Well, Phil corrects him. We fight well. And we do, but most people do nowadays. If you don't fight well, you don't survive. We fight awesome, Tommy says, bringing his arms up in a strongman pose. Any compound who rejects us would be stupid. We could clear out of town like this, no problem. Maybe we should. Then we could live here. It's not like Phil hasn't thought about settling down somewhere, finding a safe house and staying permanently. Maybe taking others in, starting a compound of their own. But here? He glances around, a small shiver working its chilly fingers up his spine. Not here, he says, crossing his arms. We're not staying here. We can set up in the back for the night if you guys want, but we're moving on tomorrow. Aww. Tubbo finds his way to their section of counters again, hands empty of any candy. He doesn't seem too disappointed. I like it here. It's quiet. Too quiet, Tommy says, and when Phil looks at him, he can see the same look of hesitation that Phil knows he must have had. Tubbo looks between them, then out into the street. It is weird, he concedes, and all 3 of them fall silent. Phil claps his hands, the noise soft, but still making both boys' shoulders jump. Into the back, he says, gesturing for them to get moving and pick up their stuff. Come on, storage room. It's getting dark, and I want to get some sleep tonight. Tommy slips off the counter, tugging a couple magazines along with him, and Tebo moves to pick up both their backpacks. Phil herds them into the back room. It's the only place in a store with only one door and a window, making it a good spot for them to all get some sleep without having to worry about staying up in shifts. Tommy and Tebo start to get out their sleeping supplies as Phil pushes a few things in front of the door, blockading them all inside for the night, and Tebo uses a can opener on the second can of beans. It's not the most conservative use of their rations, but Phil doesn't say anything about it. Dinner is over quick, and Phil uses one of the wind-up torchlights that Tebo had brought with him when it all started to light up the room for a bit. When he glances up from a novel he'd been working through, front cover torn and worn down, but pages still good, Tommy and Tebo are lying on their stomachs together with a magazine open in front of them. He doesn't say a word, just watches as Tebo fills out the Sudoku boxes with quick precision, and Tommy races to finish the word search first. "I win," Tebo says in a hushed, celebratory tone, Tommy slamming his head down against the pages. "You always win," he complains, and their voices fade into soft bickering as Phil looks back down at his book, smiling. Later, when the torch is dimmed a bit, and Tommy and Tebo have fallen asleep, pens still in hand, Phil dumps their backpacks out. He lines all of their items up, folding the shirts they'd snagged from the house before neatly, and stacking their extra clothing in the corner. It's not the clothing that's important after all. Their inventory is as such: 1.5 bottles of aspirin, one slightly used first aid kit with gauze, band-aids, small scissors, 2 compress dressings, a breathing barrier for CPR, 2 pairs of gloves, one slightly used tube of antibiotic cream, a thermometer, tweezers, and 2 antiseptic wipes. They have 3 blankets, which are all in use at the moment for their beds, and one small stuffed monkey that Tebo had been carrying since Phil met him. A few pens and markers litter the bottom of the bags, which Phil scoops up and places carefully in the front pocket. For food, there are 2 more tins of green beans left, 1 pack of dried rabbit from a lucky shot he'd gotten in the forest, a pack of crisps, and a singular granola bar. It's the food that worries him most. They're dangerously low, low enough that he considers taking most of the day tomorrow to scavenge in the town before leaving. The store they're in now was looted almost entirely, but there's a chance others weren't. He looks over their meager supplies and then back towards Tommy and Tebo. He knows they're small for their age. They're not getting the right nutrients, the right vitamins that they need to grow properly. It worries him, keeping him up at night like this, just thinking about how it's going to affect them when they get older. Not to mention things like dental hygiene, although Phil insists they all carry toothbrushes, and at least brush when they can. Water hasn't been a big deal, what with all the rain and streams they can find to fill their water bottles up to the brim with. Another thing that worries him is winter. Phil noticed how the air is getting chillier at night, and he's sure they have too. This'll be their first winter together. Usually, Phil's hunkered down somewhere the past 4 years, staying in one spot and only having to provide for himself. 3 people is substantially more than 1, and he had only scraped by last year. With 2 growing teenage boys alongside, he was worried for this round of snow. They had to find jackets, warmer clothing, and more food. They needed a safe space to wait out the cold weather. Lost in these thoughts, Phil almost didn't notice the soft knock at the door. A knock. A knock at the door, which was barricaded by heavy shelving and a few empty barrels of something a long time ago. His head snapped up as he reached for the torch, shutting it off with a quick movement. He sat there for a long moment, eyes adjusting to the dark. Then the knock came again. Fear rose in the pit of his stomach, but he didn't move, didn't dare to breathe. His axe was in reach, as it always was, and both Tommy and Tebo were asleep. If he just stayed quiet, whatever was out there would leave. Another knock, louder this time, followed rapidly by a set of 4 or 5. Phil turned to make sure neither of the boys were awake, eyes shut and chest moving slowly. Good. He glanced back at the door, listening intently. There's shuffling from outside, the sound of footsteps. One more set of knocking, eerie in how human it sounds. Phil holds his breath. More shuffling, and then it all fades into silence. No more knocks come for a long time after that, but Phil stays up anyway, just in case. Tommy and Tebo wake up a little after the sun's risen, and Phil hasn't slept at all. He's leaned against the wall, packed all their things after his check last night, and kept himself up worrying the rest of the night. He's jumpy and knows the boys see it in him, but he doesn't tell them about the knocking or shuffling from late last night. They skip breakfast, instead packing their things and heading out from the storage room. Phil takes a moment to inspect the outside of the door. There's no blood or anything, no signs of anything being there at all, just the normal wear and tear. No marks from the knocking either. Maybe he imagined it, but that thought is no more comforting than when he thought it had just been a deadwalker. Zombies first, now he's just going insane. That would be an interesting turn of events. They head out onto the street once Phil deemed it safe enough to. It's sunny again today, the clouds from last week's rainstorm gone, and only the blue sky above them. While his gut says it's a bad idea, his stomach says another, and they explore more into the town. There are no signs of the dead, just like yesterday, and it makes last night's encounter all the more strange in his mind. They look in a few stores, Tubbo getting a stroke of luck and finding a squished but unopened candy bar under the counter at a drugstore they stop in. He grins, shoving it away into his pack and ignoring Tommy's cries. Phil makes him promise to share. More luck is had when he finds a bag of rice and more cans of mixed vegetables in a house they raid, tucking it all away into their backpacks. The food makes him feel more secure, but it's still not enough, and he knows it. They have to find a place to stop. But not here. Not this quiet, empty town, where he expects a horde at every corner, and yet finds nothing. But there is something. Tubbo's the first to notice. He stops in the middle of the road where they're walking, glancing around them all at the pavement with a curious look. "What's that?" he points out, one finger going out to trace a line of something. Phil follows his gaze, and so does Tommy, both of them making their way over and all three crouching to inspect it. It's a piece of twine, small but intact, down the very center of the road. Underneath it is a strange green tint to the pavement, like some sort of moss. Tubbo reaches out, like he's going to poke it, and Tommy's hand shoots out to knock it away. "Don't fucking touch it," he says, verbalizing what Phil had been thinking exactly. "What if it's, like, poisonous? What the fuck, Tubbo?" "How else are we supposed to find out if it's dangerous?" he asks, and Tommy facepalms. "Not by touching it and dying," Phil says gently, tugging them both up by their sleeves. Tubbo's still looking down, eyes tracing the twine and moss, and following it up the road in the direction they were going. "It keeps going," he says, taking a couple steps alongside it. "Masks," Phil says, and both boys obediently tug the coverings on. "There's more up ahead," Tubbo says, voice slightly muffled by the fabric and mask now covering his nose and mouth. Phil tugs his own on, following slightly behind as Tubbo and Tommy take the lead in following the twine and moss. As they walk, more of the ground gets green, and the twine crisscrosses across the pavement, following the sections where it seems to be the deepest, like veins. "Someone's clearly been here," Phil says, catching up to the two and stopping them with a hand on their shoulders. "So we should go." The feeling is back from yesterday, shivers up his spine and a cold feeling in the pit of his stomach. "Can't we just look a bit further?" Tubbo asks, and Tommy gives him a look. "I don't know, man. This is starting to freak me out." Phil agrees with Tommy's statement, but Tubbo just glances back down the street, where the moss is clearly growing in a sea of green. There's twine everywhere down there, crisscrossing and tracking vines of darker color. Phil can see the curiosity peaking in him, so he sighs. He's going to regret this. He glances around, finding the tallest building he can see, and nods. "Let's go inside and up, alright? We can get a vantage point from up there to look, but we're not getting any closer, okay?" "Okay." Tubbo seems happy with this arrangement, and Tommy at least doesn't argue as they all make their way into the building. There's nothing to clear, no monsters at all, so they make it to the roof without much incident. Phil shoulders open the door onto the flat, gravel-packed roof, and Tubbo ducks under his arm to make his way to the edge. He stills. Phil and Tommy join him, and also go very, very still. There's a mass of dead walkers in the center of all the green, packed together in a tight circle. None of them are moving. In fact, all of them seem to be really, truly dead. From this height, it's hard to see exactly, but... "Are those flowers?" Tubbo says before anyone else can, leaning dangerously far over the side of the building. Phil grabs him by the hood of his sweatshirt and tugs him back a bit, for his own peace of mind. "What the fuck?" Tommy breathes, leaning over as well. And Tubbo's right back, so fuck it. He leans over too, trying to get a better look. It certainly appears to be some sort of flower, or leafy shape bursting out of each of the dead walkers' eyes and mouth. Their heads are tipped back, the blooms facing the sky and drinking in the sunlight. From the looks of it, there are a couple hundred spread out in this section of street. It makes sense they didn't see any of the dead earlier now, since they all appear to be here. They're a couple blocks away still, but Phil can't help but feel uneasy. He glances over at Tommy and Tubbo, and finally pulls away from the edge of the roof, tugging them both back again. "We should go. Come on." "Wait," Tubbo says, slipping out of Phil's grasp and ignoring the swear that slips out as he does. Tubbo's a quick little guy. "There's someone down there." "What?" They're all back at the edge of the roof again, and Tubbo reaches out with one hand. Phil stubbornly clings onto his hood, not letting go this time. He does, however, follow Tubbo's pointing hand and catches a glimpse of movement, something ducking and weaving through the crowd of dead. They don't pay it any mind, silent and still and facing the sky. As it ducks through the crowd and into a thinner section of monsters, Phil can make out a humanoid shape for sure, face covered by a thick mask-looking layer, and almost every inch of the person covered in fabric, head to toe. They weave their way out of the crowd, coming to a slow stop in the street. Then after a moment of just standing there, looks up. Right at them. Phil tugs both of the boys downward, ignoring their muffled noises of surprise, and quietly he holds a finger up in front of his mask. Making sure they both stay down, he risks a peek up and glances above the wall, blocking them from falling off the roof. The person is gone. "Time to go," he says, keeping his voice low and forcing it to stay even, not panicked. "Come on, other side of the roof, let's go. Don't argue." Thankfully, neither of them do. They make their way across the roof in a weird, hunched run that Phil would find funny if it weren't such a serious moment, and he peers down the side of the building, then across at the other one. There's a fire escape across the way, but they'd have to jump. The gap isn't that wide, at least that's what he tells himself, as he helps Tommy up onto the wall and tells him to jump. "What?" Tommy asks, giving him a look that's more fearful than anything he thinks he's seen on Tommy before. "Jump," he says, glancing back towards the door to the roof. "You can make it. It's okay. Jump, then Tubbo will, and you catch him and make sure he makes it. Phil, you can do it, Tommy. I promise." Phil gives him an encouraging nod, and Tommy stares at him for a second, then at Tubbo, whose eyes are wide and scared over his mask. He glances over at the other building, then seems to steel himself. He jumps, and for a second, Phil can't breathe. But like he said before, the gap's not that wide, and the fall is downward, so Tommy lands on the gravel with a thump and a rush of breath that they can hear on the other side. Phil makes sure Tommy's standing and ready before he helps Tubbo up onto the wall of the roof and sends him over. They both make it fine, thank God, and then it's his turn. Carefully, he pushes himself up, eyeing the gap, then hears a clang behind him and doesn't even bother to turn and look. He just jumps instead, weightless in the sky for a moment, before the shock of gravel and weight hits him. He rolls, hearing Tommy and Tubbo say something, but can't hear it over the rush of blood in his ears. "I'm fine," he promises, pushing himself up and glancing behind them. The person from the crowd of dead walkers is staring right at them again, this time from where Phil had just jumped from. His hand goes to his axe immediately, shifting on his feet to crowd Tommy and Tubbo behind him. They can't make it down the fire escape with the person right there, and he can see the crossbow on their hip even if they did want to try. "Phil," Tubbo says, and he can feel a hand clinging onto the sleeve of his shirt. He reaches back with his free hand, giving the small one there a pat. He can hear behind him Tommy's shuffling and the sound of his weapon unsheathing. He holds out his own axe, pointed up at the person. "We're leaving," he says, voice firm and loud enough to carry. "We're leaving, and you're going to leave us alone. We don't have anything of value. We were just passing through." His hand is steady as he holds the weapon out, and for a moment, the person on the roof above them is silent. He can hear Tommy shuffling again, feet impatient in the gravel, and he prays he doesn't say anything. After an uncomfortable few seconds of silence, he opens his mouth again to say something, but the person beats him to it. "Did you touch the moss?" The question catches him off guard, and the voice too. They're American, whoever they are. Their voice is raspy, like they haven't spoken in a while. "What?" he asks, and the person tips their head to the side, like they're exasperated. "Did any of you touch the moss?" they repeat, and Phil slowly shakes his head. "No," he tells them, and there's another few seconds of silence. "Okay," the person says, and as suddenly as they'd appeared, they back up and go out of view. Phil's silent, standing there for a second and stunned a bit by the encounter. He almost doesn't register the lack of hand on his sleeve for a moment, until Tubbo's already ahead of him, heading towards the edge of the roof with a determined glint in his eye. "Wait!" he says, voice loud. "Why shouldn't we touch the moss?" Tommy's already ahead of Phil as well, and he follows them both up and snags the back of their hoodies. "Tubbo!" Tommy says, machete in hand. "Tubbo, what?" "What?" The voice is back, and so is the figure. They stand at the edge of the roof again, looking down, as if drawn back by the question. They stare down at the trio, sounding almost surprised. "Why shouldn't we touch the moss?" Tubbo repeats, staring up at the figure as well. "Tubbo, leave it," Phil says, trying to be firm. "Let's go." "Did you touch it?" the masked person asks, and Tubbo shakes his head, ignoring Phil's words and Tommy tugging at his arm to try and get him to go. "It makes you sick." That makes them all freeze, looking up at the person again. Tubbo tips his head down like he's thinking about something, and Phil knows he's got that expression he always has whenever he's trying to do one of the word searches that Tommy loves so much, but Tubbo can never even start. "How?" he finally asks, glancing up again. Phil again feels the cold creeping up his spine, but it's less so this time. The person above them clearly seems more confused than anything else. This close, Phil can make out their eyes at least, and tufts of hair peeking out from where they aren't covered by fabric. "Spores," they say, and they glance back toward the other side of the roof they're on. "They get inside you and make you sick. Don't eat anything you find here unless it was pre-packaged." "Like allergies?" Tubbo asks, and the person just stares at them again. Phil hopes it's not allergies. If this thing was airborne, they're all fucked. They were fucked the moment they stepped into this town. "Sort of," the person says, and Phil's had enough. He gives Tubbo another tug, catching his attention and gaze. "We're going. Now," he says, glancing at the fire escape. "Come on, down. Let's go. But no buts. We're leaving. I'm not risking either of you touching this shit and getting sick, if what they say is right." He glances up, but the person is gone again. The shivers are fading, and he just wants to leave and get out of here for good. Out of this town, away from whatever was going on with those monsters. Somewhere where they were at least guaranteed a little more safety. Tubbo makes a frustrated noise, but follows their lead as they head down the fire escape with care. Tommy's quiet, which is weird for the moment, but then Phil catches the worried little glances he shoots towards Tubbo whenever he thinks no one's looking, and it makes a bit more sense. They make it to the ground in one piece, and when their feet hit the pavement, there's no sign of the masked figure from the roof. "Let's go," Phil says, turning his head left and out towards the woods and tree line. "We're not staying here anymore." "Creeps me the fuck out," Tommy says, and Phil can't help but agree. Tubbo seems somewhat frustrated, trailing along behind them as they move away from the center of the town and out toward the woods again. He keeps glancing behind them, and Phil eventually falls back a bit to match his pace. "Tubbo," he says, catching his attention. "I know it's interesting, but we're not going back." "But that person," Tubbo says. "They were alone." "Probably for a reason," Tommy calls out from ahead of them, having forged into the brush. He was whacking at trees and branches periodically, clearing them a path as they went. They'd passed the last house a bit ago, and Phil's glad to be rid of it. The woods are less dangerous, all things considered. Less dead walkers, less people, less of everything. "Probably for a reason," Phil agrees, reaching out to ruffle Tubbo's hair and then rest his hand on his shoulder. "Let's leave it behind us, okay? We have other things to worry about now." "Okay," Tubbo sighs, giving one last look behind him as they move on into the woods. As much as Phil tries to convince himself that's the end of it, some little nagging bit in the back of his brain insists that's not true. They walk for a while, even after it gets dark, at Phil's insistence. While it might be a tad more dangerous than normal, he ignores the bitching and insists they go until they can't anymore. Tubbo and Tommy eventually lapse into miserable, quiet silence, and when Phil tells them both to stop and set up, they hardly get their blankets out before they're both dead asleep, leaned up against each other and breathing quietly. Phil stays up as long as he can, leaning against a tree trunk and holding the torch in his hand, winding it absently until the light is bright enough to make both boys shift when he flicks it on. He's exhausted, but knows he has to stay awake. He has to. He can't fall asleep. The sun is creeping through the trees, faint light in the distance, and the torch is heavy in his hand. It's early morning. There are birds chirping, like lullabies, and Phil's eyes are heavy. He wakes up to screeching. For a moment, he's disoriented, the dirt cold under his legs and sun in his eyes. It's morning still, dew dripping off the leaves of a bush next to him, but the loud noise and sudden pull to wakefulness makes him forget everything for a moment. It only lasts a second, though, before he is shifting and glancing around in a panic for the source of the screech. He doesn't have to look far. Phil, it's all gone. Tommy's holding up one of their packs, the one that Phil distinctly remembers shoving the bag of rice, the tins of veggies, the green beans, and the candy bar Tubbo had found in. All of it. Now, the bag seems to be empty. Tubbo is sat on the ground, bleary-eyed and rubbing sleep from his face, seemingly just as confused as Phil. He thumps his head back against the wood of the tree and swears. All of it's gone. Tommy was right in that regard, except for the old granola bar down at the very bottom of the bag. It's in crumbly bits now when they open it, from being crushed under everything else. No wonder they left it, Tommy complains, Phil watching from the sidelines as he splits the remnants of the bar with Tubbo. He insisted they eat it. He wasn't hungry, a lie, and they needed it more, the truth. They didn't really argue with him, and by the way they scarf it down, he realizes they hadn't eaten anything really at all the day before. Shit. Phil resists the urge to swear again, staring at the empty backpack and mentally berating himself for falling asleep. He should have stayed awake, should have kept an eye out. That was everything they had, and now it was gone. Now they'd have to find something today, and their best bet was back in the direction of the town, back in the direction of the person who Phil was pretty sure stole from them. We should steal it back, Tommy argues as they roll up the blankets, tucking them into the first aid bag. That had been left untouched, probably because it was being used as a pillow by Tommy that night. It's only fair, he left us with fucking nothing. A granola bar isn't nothing, Tubbo points out, but the argument is weak, and the glare he receives from Tommy is fairly deserving. Enough, Phil says, cutting them both off from the spat that is sure to follow. He runs a hand through his hair, staring off in the direction they'd come from. Anger rises in his stomach, and after a second, he nods. Get your things, and keep your weapons out. Seriously? Tommy looks a bit shocked. We're doing my idea. Smashing shit? Stealing shit? For real? For real, Phil says, making his way to his feet and stretching his arms out, cracking his wrists. We're going to get our shit back, and if that requires us smashing and stealing shit, then so be it. But you need to listen to everything I say, including if I tell you to just book it, alright? It's 1 versus 3, Tommy crows, swinging his backpack onto his shoulders and wielding his machete out in front of him like some sort of silly pirate pose. How difficult could this even be? As it turns out, very difficult. The first problem is finding their shit. The town is as silent as it was before, and Phil doesn't let Tommy make a ruckus. The chances of waking up the dead walkers isn't 0 as far as he knows, so they go on the hunt instead, circling around the town center and giving it a relatively wide berth. They search every building, scouring it from top to bottom, and yet find no sign of the thief from yesterday. Phil's just about ready to give up and let Tommy start screeching his head off as a last resort when he hears voices. They'd split up in this latest building, him sending Tommy to the first floor, and Tubbo to the second, himself staying on the ground floor and checking each apartment carefully. The whole town was pretty much looted, but it wasn't much of a concern as finding their original things was. He'd started up the stairs to find Tommy when he'd heard the sound of voices coming from above, and instead kept going. People can't be nobody. Tubbo's voice floats down the stairwell, and Phil quiets himself as he climbs. There's a pause, then another voice, the person from yesterday. After a second, he continues up the stairs. I am, they say, and Phil can practically hear Tubbo thinking. My name's Toby, he says after a second, and Phil sighs slightly. But everyone calls me Tubbo. That's nice. They don't sound very enthused, and Phil almost has to laugh at how quickly Tubbo responds despite it. How do you know so much about the moss? He struggles to find the right words for a minute, and Phil slows his ascent. He's not asking about the food, which is interesting. Distracting, maybe? Tubbo's certainly smart enough to be able to stall for a bit while Phil and Tommy make their way up. I was a botany student. From how clipped their answers are, Phil almost expected them to not be so forthcoming. Botany. Plants, right? Silence, and then Tubbo forges on. I always liked plants. It's weird to think they've made the world go upside down. That's why everyone got sick, right? The moss and spores? Kind of. The voice sounds amused, almost. Phil can understand. Talking with Tubbo is like that. It's a fungi, technically, more related to animals than plants. How do you know? Tubbo sounds legitimately interested, and Phil slowly starts to climb the stairs again. He peers into each hallway as he goes up, finally finding the one they're at. The door to the hallway is open slightly, and he slips inside, locating the room with the voices carefully. Botany classes. They're louder now, and Phil tips his head to slowly peer into the room. Do you use a microscope? Tubbo's across the ruined living room from the masked figure, his own mask on as well. He's looking at the person, and his gaze doesn't even flick to Phil, but Phil knows he's been seen. Smart kid. Microscope? The person tips their head, and Tubbo smiles, snapping his fingers. That! He grins, making a circle with his fingers and peering through it. Phil's not quite sure what that's supposed to mean, so he ignores it. No. Their voice is flat, and Tubbo lowers his fingers with a disappointed look. Oh, well that sucks. He pauses. So, can we have our food back? No. The person doesn't even hesitate, leaning against the side table and crossing their arms. Then tenses up as Phil rests the blade of his axe gently between their shoulder blades. Tubbo smiles. I'd like our food back, Phil says carefully. With slow care, the person's hands go up in the air, fingers splayed out, and after a minute, they turn around a bit. Phil doesn't move the axe, letting it hang in the air between them. Closer now, he can see the faint twitch in their eyes as they stare at the blade, then glance back to where Tubbo's leaning against the doorframe. Phil can tell they're debating what to do here. Make it easy, he suggests. We're not asking for everything you have, just what you took. There are footsteps on the stairs, then Tommy's at the door as well. Are you... he begins, then catches a glimpse of everything that's happening, and adjusts his grip on his blade. Phil can see the moment the person in front of him realizes he's probably fucked, their shoulders slipping down a bit. Phil feels almost bad, but not really. There's a stalemate for a moment, then the person slowly lowers their hands again. Fine, they say, letting out a deep breath. Fine, sure. You can have your stuff back. You win. Yay! Tubbo pushes off the doorframe he'd been leaning on, practically skipping over to where Tommy is by the door. They fist bump, and Phil sighs. It's not like they've gotten it back yet, after all. Come on, Phil says, tipping his head towards the door, and the person hesitantly makes their way along. Phil stays behind, letting the two boys go first and keeping the mystery guy between them. He hasn't gotten a good look at his face yet due to the mask, and yet he can tell from the tension in his shoulders that he's stressed as hell. Down 3 flights of stairs they go, mostly quiet for the moment. Tubbo and Tommy stop by the front door, and Phil raises a brow. Let's go, he says, and then he realizes why they've stopped. All 4 of them fall silent, staring out the small window of the door and unmoving. Outside is a sea of dead walkers. Holy shit, Tommy says quietly, barely above his breath. Phil lowers his axe gently, and all the plans in his head go out the window. None of them move, just staring as the shuffling dead walk past. They're all moving in the same direction, toward the center of town. Towards the others. In front of him, their masked hostage shifts and starts to turn. The roof, they whisper quietly to Phil, moving with a certain care. Up. Yeah, Phil says in return, mouth dry. It's all he dares to say, shifting forward to snag Tommy and Tubbo's attention and gently draw them back from the door. Carefully, they all move backwards until they're out of sight of the door and the crowd, and then they all turn and go back up the stairs, and Masky pushes open the door to the roof. What the fuck? Tommy says, staring down off the roof and at the dead walking. What the fuck, what the fuck, what the fuck? They're migrating. They're shuffling from their new companion, and they tug out a notebook from a pocket somewhere and move to scribble something down. I thought this might happen, but I wasn't sure when. Well, nice fucking timing, Tommy hisses, and Phil peers over the side of the roof carefully. There's probably about 25 of them at the moment, shuffling their way towards the huge mass of dead in the center of the town. They're slow about it. Some of them are missing limbs, a lot of them are decayed, like they'd crawled out of spots where they'd been for a year or more. "How are we supposed to get out?" Tubbo asks, his voice sorta shaky. "They'll sprout in a few days, probably," says their companion, peeking over the edge along with the rest of them. "Once they've sprouted, they can't move anymore as far as I know. You can walk right through the center of the crowd. I have." "We can't just stay up here for a few days," Phil points out. "We don't have any food, unless you have it with you." "I don't." Wonder whose fault that is," Tommy mutters and shoots a glare. He gets one in return, and Phil is quick to step between them. "No, we're not arguing now. If we all want to make it out of here, we're working together." He turns to face their new companion, tapping his fingers anxiously on the handle of his axe. "Is that alright?" I don't usually..." Phil watches as the guy trails off, eyes flicking from him to both Tommy and Tubbo. Then he shifts to glance over the roof of the building. He sighs. "Alright, yeah, fine. Good. We're gonna try and stealth this," Phil says, ignoring Tommy's huff of annoyance. They're all focused on getting to the rest, it looks like, so if we're quiet and stay out of sight for the most part, then we should be able to sneak to wherever you hole up at night. Is that fine? "You want me to lead you right back to my base?" The guy wrinkles his face up, leaning back. "Not a fucking chance." Phil bites back the annoyed words he wants to spit out, instead settling for something more compromising. He doesn't want this guy to just run off after all, and leave the three of them behind in the dust. "How about just somewhere nearby?" he asks, and he can practically see the wheels turning again in the guy's head. "Fine," he finally concedes, stepping over to look down again at the zombies below them. Phil does the same, checking to see where they all are. He almost jumps when the guy speaks. "We want to get across the street, then across the next. From there, it's a straight shot through backyards, so it'll be safer." "Okay." Phil nods, turning to Tommy and Tubbo. Below them are about 25 of the dead shambling along. Phil doesn't think any of them will be quick enough to grab hold of them if they need to run, but he's not risking anything. "Tommy, you go first, behind him. Tubbo behind you, and I'll bring up the rear. Sound alright?" The guy gives him a look, then shrugs nonchalantly. His whole demeanor has shifted somewhat, from being pissed off but meek, into something a bit more dangerous. Phil notes how he's shifting his weight side to side. "Fine by me," he says, voice flat in tone and emotion. "Now let's go before more show up." "You think more are gonna show up?" Tommy sounds too excited for Phil's personal taste, so he reaches out and taps him on the forehead as they all start to make their way back down the stairs. "We don't want more to show up," he reminds him, watching Tommy's face wrinkle in surprise at the finger and skin brushing against his own. In front of them, Tubbo skipped a few steps in order to catch up to the thief. "What's your name?" he asks brightly, and the entire stairwell seems to hold its breath all at once. They're still moving, still quietly descending to the ground floor, but neither Tommy nor Phil are paying attention to each other anymore. The guy is quiet for a minute.
"Technoblade."
"Technoblade," he finally answers, and Tommy bursts out laughing. Then he covers his mouth with a hand, like he has remembered they were trying to be quiet in the first place. It earns him a glare from Technoblade, eyes flashing. "What?" he snaps, staring up from the stairwell beneath them. "Too cool for you?" "More like a fucking weeb," Tommy says once he's recovered from the surprised laughter, and Phil has to take a moment to stop and cover his mouth as well. It is an amusing name, and Tommy is sort of right. "What are you, some sort of protagonist?" "At least mine's more interesting than Tommy. How fucking banal," Technoblade says, holding his head up primely as he jumps down another flight of stairs. They all follow, and Phil can tell Tubbo's grinning below his mask. The quip comes as expected. "Tommy's got the worst name out of all of us," he teases, and Tommy goes bright red with rage. "I think Techno's right. I can call you Techno, yeah?" "Sure, do what you want." Techno is deadpan. "That's not fair. Phil's name is boring. It's Phil, short for Philip or something stupid like that." Tommy turns backwards, taking a few steps down that way and tripping a bit before turning back around. Phil waits to roll his eyes until Tommy's not looking at him, smirking a little. "Yeah, but it could be cooler if we try. Like Philza. Philza. A little pep on the end." Tubbo pipes up to defend him. Phil raises a brow. His name doesn't need to be cool. "Philza?" Techno looks up at them again, and Phil snorts. "You know, I kinda like it," Phil says, just to hear Tommy turn into a tea kettle from rage. He's still laughing as they reach the bottom floor finally, and then all goes quiet. They all do as they remember what they're coming down here for, and Tommy finally settles down a bit. They stand there for a moment, then Techno reaches up behind his shoulder and pulls out a sword, an honest-to-God sword. Phil doesn't bother to question, just tugs out his own axe, and hearing the similar sounds as each boy takes out their own weapons. Remember, Phil says, positioning the two younger boys in front of them like he'd talked about before. We want to get out of here without having to fight anything, okay? Just be quiet and follow. He receives two solemn nods in return, although he pins Tommy down with his eyes and hopes that it gets the message across. No funny business, no hero moves. The last thing they need are all the dead out there to hear the commotion and come for their throats. They're capable, but not capable enough to take on 25 of the suckers. Techno opens the door. Outside is quiet, but Phil can still hear shuffling and scraping. Techno peers out, then carefully steps outside. Tommy follows, then Tubbo, then Phil. He leaves the door open behind them. Thankfully, the dead have all shifted to the left side of the street, heading toward the center of town. There's none to the right, so they can easily slip behind the small horde and through the alleys. Phil's relieved. Tommy trips, a curse leaving his mouth before he can stop it. He catches himself halfway through the fall, looking relieved and proud before he realizes exactly what he's done. Down the road to their left, one of the dead walkers' heads snap backwards, and either catches sight of them or smells them. Phil thinks their eyeballs have long rotted away, only leaving hollows behind in their skull. They move on instinct now, barreling down the street. For decayed human bodies, they move fast. But Techno moves faster. Phil is busy readying himself to swing when he realizes the other man has already stepped out and intercepted a zombie, watching a head roll slowly across the pavement. Guess we're fighting this one out now, Techno calls across to him, and Phil just nods. Get to the other side of the street, he instructs Tommy and Tubbo, heaving his axe out and gratified to see the dead thing slump over, petrified innards spilling out and over the ground. Go! He gives them a second and watches them go, then turns back to the quick motherfuckers who are currently descending on them like vultures, eyes and heads twitching to follow his every movement. Fighting these things isn't fun. It's not the most difficult thing anymore, but it's messy and disgusting and unpleasant. Phil takes out one or two, and when he glances over to where Techno had been last, he sees probably a half dozen. All he has time to do is think, damn, before he's swinging his axe again and backing up, wincing at the squelch it makes as it meets flesh. Careful, someone says behind him, and Phil whirls around to see Techno there, a body impaled on a sword and eyes crinkled. Like under the mask, he's smiling. Breathless, Phil just nods his thanks and continues backing up, to where he'd seen Tommy and Tubbo run toward just a few moments ago. There's a slight crash from his left and he turns, catching sight of Tommy in the street, kicking aside a trash can from where he'd probably knocked it over. As if a whistle had been blown, all of the dead are suddenly moving toward the noise, and in turn, Tommy. Shit, Phil says, and it's damn near in sync with Tommy's. Oh shit, he says, glancing up and around and meeting Phil's eyes. Then he ducks, avoiding a swinging arm of one of the dead. Tubbo's further back between buildings, Phil can see, so he heads up the street to interfere. Tommy's taking care of the one zombie that made it to him, so Phil takes precious seconds to dispose of the two dead walkers that had managed to crawl his way. In those moments, something happens, and when he glances up, Tommy's distracted, trying to pull his machete out of the body of one of the dead. Behind him comes another, fingers and teeth reaching out towards bare arm and skin with dreadful intention. Behind you! Phil can hear the panic in Tubbo's voice, mirroring his own inner thoughts as Tommy wrenches himself backwards and right into the walker's grasp. Tommy! The shout is frightened and scared, and worst of all, coming from right behind Phil. He throws his arm out, but it's already too late, Tubbo having seen it coming and ducking under. He's moving fast enough that he gets to Tommy before Techno can turn around, and slamming into him sideways. Tommy falls onto the pavement, the clatter of metal ringing in Phil's ears as he darts forward to follow in a panic. Tubbo's screaming. One of his arms, clothed thank God, has a zombie hanging off of it, its rotted and decaying jaw grasping onto his skin and fabric like a deranged animal. The screaming cuts short when something goes squelch, and Phil pulls his axe out of the thing's side before he can really process what he's doing. It lets go in favor of coming towards him instead, which turns out to be a bad fucking move, as Phil slams his axe directly into its head, splitting the skull down the center and making the rest of its body go still. They're finally quiet for a moment, the only sounds their heavy panting, then Tommy's shouting, and Techno's there too, and Phil is grabbing Tubbo's arm in a panic. I'm fine, I'm fine! Tubbo's words go faintly in one ear and out the other as Phil looks over his arm, inspecting every bit of torn fabric for blood. There's a lot of congealed old dried bits, but nothing too fresh. The skin under his sleeve seems to be unbroken. Tommy is babbling somewhere on the other side of Tubbo, and Phil only tunes in once he's determined that everything is fine. Dragging a hand down his face, he drops the arm in his grasp and shuts his eyes. Motherfucker, he exhales. Never do that again. I'm fine, Tubbo repeats weakly, and Tommy slams his forehead onto Tubbo's shoulder loud enough for Phil to wince. And then he does it again. I hate you, Tommy says a second later, and there's a hand on Phil's shoulder that makes him jump and remember that there's a fourth person here. He turns, grimacing a bit at the mess they've made that's now littering the street. Thanks for cleaning up, Phil says, glancing back at Tubbo and then at Techno again warily. Some people get weird about close calls, and Phil's seen enough of Techno's brutal efficiency with dealing with the dead to think he might also be one of those types. When Phil looks around the street, there are a dozen or so bodies lying around that he didn't even remember seeing Techno take care of. He'd just done it. And as he wipes the blade of his sword off and sheathes it, there's almost an elegance to his familiarity with it. A terrifying elegance. Thankfully, in regards to Tubbo, all the other does is peer forward a bit and wrinkle his nose. Phil doesn't think he could take him in a fight. Glad he's alright, he says, shifting his weight backwards again and turning toward the sidewalk. We should go, though. Phil agrees, so he gives Tommy and Tubbo one last moment before urging them onwards. He half expected Techno to run off in the midst of all that chaos, and yet he follows along after a moment anyways. They end up at Technoblade's base, which Phil isn't really expecting. Techno's base isn't really a base. It's a basement, yes, but it's bare bones at best. It's no surprise when Techno hands them a bag of their food back from a bin under a counter that the occasional notebook makes an appearance around the room. It is something of a surprise when Techno accepts a part of the food Phil offers back, and Phil's not expecting Techno to say yes when Tubbo asks if he'd like some company for a while. Although, maybe looking around the bare, lonely space, maybe it's not all that much of a surprise. Later that night, when Phil is asleep and Techno is somewhere in his base, and Tommy's curled up on the floor next to him, Tubbo turns his arm over in his hands and sneaks a couple bandages from their med kit to slap onto the scrapes from the zombied teeth that he managed to cover up before Phil had gotten to his arm and looked at it. Why'd you do that? Tommy asks from behind him, having woken up when their blankets had shifted, but not bothered him until now. Tubbo breathes in through his nose and out through his teeth, extending his arm carefully before bringing it back towards his body. He's going to have to wear long sleeves until they heal up. Because, Tubbo says. Because he's not sure what else to say. It was stupid, Tommy says after a minute. You're stupid. Tubbo doesn't hesitate to fire it back, and then a moment later the floodgates break. You threw yourself into that fight and had no regard for your surroundings, idiot. I wouldn't have had to do it if I hadn't seen you, if you hadn't... He trails off, both of them listening quietly as Phil shuffles next to them, still asleep based on the rise and fall of his chest. Do you think he'd be mad if he knew we were hiding it? Tommy asks a second later, not even bothering to respond to Tubbo's little rant from a moment ago. He'd have to worry less about you. That sits heavy on Tubbo's mind for a minute, and then he shrugs. I'll tell him someday, he says, although he feels like he's lying without consciously doing so. Probably. Someday. The topic of his immunity hasn't come up at all in conversation recently, although before they'd met Phil, some days it was all they could talk about. They'd sit in some quiet corner and think back, babbling about it. It being the day back when it all started, when Tubbo sported a bleeding shoulder and they sobbed quietly together in Tubbo's parents' basement and waited for it all to end, and how it never did. The scars still burn some days. Whenever you want, Big T. Tommy's voice is getting heavier with sleep, and Tubbo shifts to lie down again beside him. The day had been exhausting, and it's comforting to know they're in a relatively safe place for the night, even if Techno had up and disappeared. As long as they were together, Tubbo reckoned, nothing could go truly wrong. Good night, Tommy. Good night.